All right, here we go. Today is Sunday, March 1st, 2020, and this is episode 247 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Good evening, Jerry. How are you, sir?
I am good. I'm kind of tired of traveling, but
I was going to say...
Tired from traveling, I should say.
You probably sound different to a lot of folks on the show, and that's because you're in a very equity secure, undisclosed location.
Otherwise known as a hotel room, yes. With bad acoustics.
Well,
and a condenser microphone, so yes.
In all seriousness, what some of the voiceover artists do is they will actually go into a closet and they'll build a little kind of foam and cloth box that they will surround their microphone with and put it over their head. And, I'm just saying, if you wanted to be a professional.
I'm not that... I guess what you're saying is I'm not that committed to my craft here.
What I'm saying is that first you need to put something over your head.
Oh, okay. And preferably plastic.
It's not a toy.
Okay, fair enough. No, there are. I have seen on Amazon they have the little three-sided deal with the sound insulating foam, but that seems like it'd be a big pain in the ass to travel with. So
yeah, probably true. But anyway, so that's why Jerry's equity today. So please forgive us.
So the first story tonight comes from Security Week. And the title here is State-Sponsored Cyber Spies Use Sophisticated Server Firewall Bypass Technique. Woohoo! Wow. So here's the deal. Sophos discovered some malware running on servers of a particular organization running in AWS. Those servers were behind a firewall that only allowed port 80 and port 443 through, and yet there was kind of bidirectional command and control stuff happening, and what they discovered was a Trojan on apparently a bunch of different servers, both Linux and Windows. The way this Trojan got there is the subject of some speculation, but basically it's The novelty here is that the Trojan itself basically intercepts. There's a shim that listens or intercepts traffic coming in on 80 and 443 and routes specially formatted traffic to the Trojan. And then when the Trojan needs to respond, it gets sent back out the HTTP or HTTPS port to the command and control server. So
that shim must be sitting on the web server itself because it's got to be able to decrypt the traffic. So it's got to be like after the web server decrypts the HTTPS traffic. And
correct.
Takes a look at it. Interesting. Yeah.
Exactly. So the challenge here is that if you're looking at just kind of what ports are open and you're taking solace in you've got a firewall in place, that's not it's not a foolproof solution. Now, having said that, this is apparently been attributed to some super sophisticated nation state, but I think that the thing that I've learned over the years is that this stuff kind of trickles down to the masses over time. So we should definitely expect that this will be coming to the average Bitcoining mining rig. Bitcoin malware pretty soon. So,
So a couple of thoughts I had. The article has a really cute picture, which I thought was kind of funny. Somebody at the marketing department did some fun art there. So you should check out the article just for that alone. But so we don't necessarily know how that original exploit happened that allowed them to drop the malware on there that they used. Doesn't seem like we know that.
Correct. They speculate in the article that it got there through an SSH brute force, which is interesting because the firewall was not configured to allow SSH through. So, that says, well, either that changed, at some point the system was, SSH was exposed, or there's some other system in the environment that the adversary is reflecting off of. Or the web application that's running on the system has some vulnerability that allows, like maybe a file upload vulnerability where that allowed them to the adversary to take control. But that was something that they do not definitively know.
Yeah, and they don't know, and they didn't talk about this at all in the article, but I was wondering, and we don't know because we don't have a copy of the code or examples of the CNC code, but I wonder if a WAF would have spotted any of the CNC code as malformed or malicious content in the HTTPS stream. It'd be interesting if a WAF could help stop some of this sort of behavior, but I guess it depends on how innocuous the CNC type communication looks and where they're doing it, how they're doing it. But I know some WAFs can get pretty sophisticated about saying, certain sizes of certain packets need to be this, and headers can only be so big. So I'd be curious what the CNC traffic looked like, and if a good WAF could have spotted it.
Based on the way they've described the traffic, it seems very likely that this is something that could be detected and stopped by a WAF. But again, that's just pure speculation, but it is pretty clearly doing something to trigger the shim to route traffic to the Trojan. Now, having said that, there's the obvious arms race. You put in a WAF that blocks it, and then they'll make the traffic look less less different than everything else. So
yeah, it depends on if you're specifically being targeted, they're looking for targets of opportunity. If you're a target of opportunity, making their life more difficult means they'll move on. If you're specifically targeted, that's tough.
Yeah, and I suspect, this is again also hypothesis, but I have this feeling that most of the time, advanced adversaries are not really after targets of opportunity. They tend to be after specific targets. Now, having said that, they may use targets of opportunity to get to specific targets, i.e. through creating a watering hole attack or something like that. But
or joining a friend's podcast for 5 years to eventually work your way into his confidence to steal all of his money.
Wow, that sounds pretty serious.
Just hypothetically.
Yeah, that's an interesting hypothesis right there. Yeah,
uh-huh.
We'll have to keep an eye on that. All right. So this kind of goes back to the point that we have to enhance our ability to detect anomalies. Not only at the edge of the network, but also on systems themselves. And it kind of points out, quite likely, if you were running a CrowdStrike or a Carbon Black or something like that, you very likely would be able to see this. Now, obviously, again, it's an arms race, so can't say that it would would always be so. But it does point out that as time goes on, we have to have the ability to have deeper insight into the happenings on our systems, because we can't rely on looking at things from the outside and assuming that we're going to see something unusual that triggers our triggers us to understand that something is going wrong.
Yeah, agreed. And the cloud stuff is just making this even more complicated because it's a new domain with different operational parameters we're not used to. And once again, we've got to get our arms around that, or it's going to get out ahead of us.
Absolutely. All right. The next story comes from ZDNet, and the title here is "Ransomware Victims Thought Their Backups Were Safe. They Were Wrong."
Dun, dun, dun.
It was a really interesting, it's just kind of a slight diversion before we get into it. a pretty interesting separate article about how I think over the past several years there were 7 or 8 instances where different police departments across the U.S. had lost data such that it impacted ongoing criminal cases, which is just really fascinating.
Yeah. The old crime dramas of the bad guy getting off on a technicality when all the technicality could be the evidence was lost due to ransomware.
Right.
Right.
But it does set up an interesting dynamic. If you think about what's going on with Soda no Kibi and Maze, where the ransomware purveyors are threatening to release the data. So now, the police department in this case has an incentive to get the data back, but but it's the criminals who have an incentive to keep the data private, right? So it seems like, if you're the criminals, you would want to, go and try to pay off those ransomware gangs so that they don't disclose the data that would then be used to incriminate you.
Yeah, you could start up a whole side business of, hey, I've got access to this police department, and I know you're being prosecuted. I can make that evidence disappear.
Go away. Right. It's a cottage industry in the making.
It is. And or if you're a ransomware group, you could be like, hey, instead of Bitcoin, how about some of that captured meth?
Wow. Or seized guns, or
sure.
I mean, yeah, so many different opportunities there.
But is it quite? I would say most police departments, like most government organizations, are on tight budgets with limited resources, but the implication of them losing their data is really impactful. But I doubt that they're being given the budget or the expertise to defend it as we would probably like. And it's going to get more interesting, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
I'm waiting for after the 2020 census that, 5 months later, well, guys, we got to kind of do it again. See? Wait.
We forgot to back it up. Yes.
Yeah.
So the story here is that a lot of organizations appear to be getting the message about the importance of backups. However, sometimes the message is getting a little skewed. So the deal is that the UK National Cybersecurity Centre has updated its guidance in response to some recent problems, which encourages people not only to back up their data, but also to ensure that their backups, or they have at least one backup that is offline, so that if they have a ransomware attack at any given time, that there is a backup of the data that is safe from being overwritten. And this is a problem because when you think about it, any device that's connected to your system, a system that's being encrypted, including file sync and share services or USB backup drives or what have you, even remote file servers, the data on those are going to get encrypted. Now, there are certain services like Dropbox and Microsoft OneDrive and some others that will allow you to recover old versions, but only up to a point. I mean, there's a limit on how far back you can go in terms of time, and then also most of them have a certain number of versions that you can go back. Now, like I think I believe it's Dropbox, maybe it's OneDrive. I read so many different things recently that will only let you go 25 versions back.
Which is interesting because 25 versions, I guess they must be doing some sort of delta compression on that because of just storing the differences. Because if they were to store 25 discrete versions of every file you backed up, that would not be viable. That's too much space. So they must be doing something fancy, which is fine. But, they bring this up in the article, and you mentioned it too. A lot of people are like, hey, I've got cloud backup, I'm good to go. Well, here's the thing. Those cloud backups recognize when a file changes and backs it up and overwrites the old one. So by default, if you had your files encrypted, your cloud backup is now overwriting your unencrypted files with the encrypted version of those files. So it's really handy for hands-off backup, but now you go to, your cloud backup's trying to have the latest version all the time and keep it handy and safe for you. Well, guess what? That latest version is the one that's fully encrypted, and the previous version is gone. Unless you do what you're talking about, which is somehow have revisioning that goes back far enough in time and in versions, or somehow have an offline. The problem that I think a lot of organizations have is backups are really easy when they're automated and automatic and online. When you start talking about offline, that gets expensive in terms of people and complexity of your infrastructure. But yeah, this is the problem. If your backups are connected to the machine that's got ransomware on it, a lot of these guys will now go look at connected drives and map drives and USB sticks and whatever else is, and external drives that are attached to that same box, and have at it.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen this go awry several times, where organizations have conflated disaster recovery scenarios and just assumed that their hot site, they have SAN-to-SAN replication in place, and that SAN-to-SAN replication will just happily replicate any kind of corruption from one side to the other, and now you have a very expensive, mirrored set of corrupt data, which is just amazing. So it really does warrant kind of thinking through how this needs to work for your organization. I do like in the NCSC's write-up, they make a reference to the 3-2-1 rule, which is a very easy thing to remember. It's 3 different devices, backups to 3 different devices. 3 different copies and 2 different devices, one of which is offsite.
Then the question is, at what velocity? Like, how often? And this is the next challenge is for an offsite, offline backup, how recent is that data if you've got to restore?
Well, now you're starting to talk about, RPOs, right? The traditional disaster recovery point objectives. How long can your business, how much time can you afford to lose in your data? So, at any given point in time, let's assume that you've lost a certain amount of data. Is 1 hour worth of data okay? Is 2 hours, 8 hours? Because that's what's going to tell you how often you need to do those backups. And they have, obviously, as you were pointing out, pretty significant implications based on how tight that RPO needs to be.
Yeah, it becomes problematic. I mean, certainly having a week's old data is better than no data. But
correct. Now, the one thing they don't talk about in here is the other side of the whole RPO discussion, which is RTO. And we've seen in some instances where organizations, even though they had backups, they chose to pay the ransom anyway because it would just take too long for them to go in and recover data off of their backups and get everything back up and running, which is kind of mind-boggling when you think about it. But I guess in certain circumstances it might kind of make sense. But again, when you're designing a solution to protect your data, you have to consider both of those things. Just because you can recover the data doesn't necessarily mean you can recover it in a time that is useful to your business.
Indeed.
So,
it gets complicated. Bad guys suck.
They definitely do. Absolutely. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that the United States Securities and Exchange Commission released a new document this past week called Cybersecurity and Resiliency Observations. And this comes from the a particular group in the SEC called the OCIE. I think it's the Office of Compliance and Investigations Enforcement, or something like that. It doesn't sound like a group that I would want to piss off, to be honest. They are the overseers of brokerages and that sort of thing. So, stock trading platforms and things. I don't believe they have domain over public companies, at least this part of the SEC. So kind of with that in that context in mind, the list they have here is pretty good. What occurs to me is that it's yet another list.
Well, the more lists, the better, right?
It's yet another list with more high level, fuzzy platitude level guidance, and I guess I'm just getting old and cranky, and which is probably certainly true.
Yes,
but I'm getting impatient with the industry is kind of on fire right now. I mean, we have lots and lots of issues, and we have regulators like this releasing guidance which is intended to be helpful, and I think it's done in the vein of, we have to do something to help. And so let's look across our constituents and find out what seems to be working, and we'll put that into a guide, which is exactly what this is. But at the end of the day, there's really, it's so high level. And in fact, they actually go on to say that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to this. It's almost... I think we get buried, right? You can open up any given security news website on any given day, and some either vendor, regulator, security thought leader, whatever, is crapping out some new framework of controls that they believe will lead you to salvation, and and there's never any significant guidance on how to actually do this. And I guess I'm just getting annoyed by that. Can you tell? I can,
and I think you're right in many ways. I think that the industry rewards these attempts at guidance, so that's why it's going to keep happening. I think there's a lot of customers who are hungry for it, but I think back, I try to equate to what we do maybe to a lawyer, and you probably don't see a lot of lawyers putting out this sort of thing, because if you ask a lawyer any sort of straight-up question, their typical answer is, well, it depends. I need more information and details about the specifics of the situation. And I think that's very true for InfoSec. There certainly are high-level platitudes that work, that apply to many situations, two-factor authorization. But until you get into the weeds, it's really tough to have actionable advice for a specific organization or situation. We can kind of do it a little bit on the show because we're taking a specific situation and trying to dissect it, but it's still very unique to each organization how they approach their InfoSec. Now, maybe that's bad. Maybe it shouldn't be that way. Maybe it should be more like engineering or architecture or whatnot, where there are certain accepted standards and practices of the industry, and you will build the building this way for these sorts of tolerances and loads, and that's just the way it's going to be. But we don't do that in InfoSec. In fact, we always seem to be reinventing the wheel and fail to learn from our own experiences and examples, and we want to keep touching the fire ourselves over and over again, and we don't seem to pass along accepted best practices very well. Everybody wants to do it their own way.
Yeah, I certainly see a lot of that. I guess the thing that concerns me, and maybe I'm doing a bad job of explaining myself. Not that I think you misunderstood. I think that a lot of security happens on the margins when you are making risk trade-off decisions. I suspect that you could go to any given security department. Now, I know that there's going to be exceptions, right? But the types of guidance that are in here are pretty well known, right? There's nothing in here that you're going to read it and say, oh my gosh, this is just a great idea. If we did this, all of our problems would be solved. It's not that kind of guidance. It's the same kind of, basic blocking and tackling stuff, which it's good stuff. Look, I don't mean to bash on the SEC, because I think this is obviously a well thought out list of stuff.
There's nothing in here I disagree with.
Exactly. Yeah. It is all good stuff, as most all of these lists are. It comes down to how they are implemented. If you read this and you have the best of intentions to implement this stuff, you're never going to be able to do that. It comes down to how you in your organization make trade-offs.
Well, I'll pick on a couple of just examples at random that are very, very well known. Patch management. This is all they say about patch management. Establish a patch management program covering all software, i.e. in-house developed, custom off-the-shelf, and other third-party software, and hardware, including antivirus and anti-malware installation. Okay. There's 1,000 different... I don't disagree, but there's 1,000 different ways to go about that. And
right. And nobody can do it all the time. So what do you do instead? What do you do when you can't do that?
They're not wrong to say that, but if it were that simple, we wouldn't still be struggling with it as an industry.
Yeah, so maybe that's where some of the focus has to come, because I see lots of these lists of, here are the core controls, but I don't almost ever see, the other side. Here is how to think about things when you can't do things the way they should be done. Here's how to assess risk, and here's some guidelines on what is acceptable and what is not. I mean, obviously, again, that's difficult to do because there's so many different things.
Are you saying, kind of like, if I go back to my two-factor, you've got an executive who's got a tablet and for whatever reason cannot or will not use two-factor, but needs to get access to certain data on the go, so they can't use two-factor, so how do you secure it instead?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, you know what? That's always going to be beyond the basics. That's nuance that only comes from experience and hardcore, down in the dirt training that isn't some vendor telling you their tool can solve all your problems.
Well, that's true. I mean, these are operational issues that tend to be unique to specific organizations. But I still think that even so, there's probably some commonalities. There's probably some rules of thumb that can be developed to help organizations make better decisions when it comes to security. And I don't know what I know there's lots of of fancy or in some pretty extensive programs like FAIR and and there's threat modeling programs and so on and so forth. But the reality is most of those are unapproachably complex, and it just occurs to me that kind of like these things here I would consider to be like heuristics. We have to have certain heuristics in place in order to protect our data. We have to you keep the bad guys out and let the good guys in, and so on and so forth, least privilege and all that stuff. But it seems like what we don't yet have are good heuristics on handling the edge cases and the things that don't work the way they should.
All right, but to push back slightly, we can't even get the basics right. Right?
Well, yeah, fair. That's
so,
fair.
I mean, I don't.
But why can't we get the basics right? And I think one of the reasons we can't get the basics right is because we make bad decisions.
Well, sure. But I guess what I'm saying is that I've seen a lot of good be the enemy of perfect.
Sure.
Or perfect be the enemy of good enough. And
yeah.
Edge case extremists, as I like to call them, getting hung up on low probability events, ruining an 80 percentile solution.
Yes.
And so I guess my only caveat or pushback on what you're saying is that, if I can at least do task management on 80% of my environment, that's better than doing none. Even though I know I've got gaps or I can't fix everything, I can at least lower my footprint and lower my attack surface to a certain degree by doing the basics to a certain degree. But I think we also get caught up in not doing the basics well because vendors push new tools and educate the market and convince CISOs and CIOs to go buy the shiny new tool. And they want to do fun new things like, threat hunting and attribution and that sort of, and deception technology when we should be spending those resources and time on asset management and patching, in my opinion. But that's not sexy, and that doesn't sell Ferraris, right? So I think...
No, you're right.
And I think that there's a maturity level that some of those tools make a lot of sense for once you're mature enough. But when we jump forward on that maturity timeline and start deploying this other stuff that is meant for a far more mature organization that's got the basics down fairly well, I think we're working on the wrong thing and we're, chopping down the wrong forest, but we feel like we're making progress. And I don't, I could get off on a whole rant on that, and I know this is probably not necessarily what you want to talk about with this particular article, but I do feel that a lot of times organizations get very distracted by shinies, and they don't spend their resources where they need to. Or, similarly, but slightly different, I often wonder, when you get this guidance from government organizations, if you're a regulated entity of some variety that has the government coming in and auditing you, I have seen, I fear that certain organizations, much like PCI, will play to PCI only, right? Study for the test. And they just got to pass their regulated exam and they're good. Sometimes it's got to go beyond that. And so, I don't know, this shit gets complicated.
Well, if it weren't complicated and it were easy, none of us would have jobs.
Yeah.
Right. It just and by the way, you are correct. I wasn't intending to say or propose that we should we should be thinking about, well, how do we avoid the 80% solution and ensure we get the 100%? That's my point was, we should absolutely go off and do the 80%, but we should be thinking about, how should we think about that remaining 20%? Is it acceptable to leave it like that? Should we go off and do something about it? How do we make that decision? Is it more important for us to spend money to go fix that remaining 20% that we're not patching, or should we put the money that we would use to fix that in improving our asset management system? Or that's the, I guess, where I'm at is, how do we think about the trade-offs?
Well, I think there's a value of diminishing returns as you get close to 100% of coverage on something. Right? And it gets much more expensive that last few percentile. Yeah. I think that's where leadership and experience comes into play, and good guidance from, senior leadership who've been there, done that. And, but also understand, hey, what is the risk trade-off for the organization? Can I accept this risk? Or If I can cover my 80 percentile for $10,000, with the last 20, the next 10% costs me another $20,000, and the last 10% causes me $50,000. Where is the trade-off? And I think that's where we struggle, right? We have these 100 percentile solutions. Everything must be covered. Well, guess what? I can't cover everything. There's going to be things on my network that my scanner doesn't know how to look at.
Right.
And whether we like it or not, we're ignoring that.
There it is, yeah.
Right. And we don't accept reality. So, when we tell the auditors or whomever, yeah, we scan 100, we've got good coverage for everything on the network. Well, do you? Well, then there's that mainframe we can't scan because it breaks it. And this printer goes wonky, and that camera over there goes cattywampus, so we can't scan that. That's where it starts to get a little more nuanced.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So I don't know. I still am a believer that most organizations should be spending their energy working on the basics and making the basics as efficient and repeatable and automated as possible, and that will solve a lot of their problems. And trying to get too sophisticated too early without the right staff and without the right skill sets and without the right budget, I think is a distraction, and it's a risk that a lot of CISOs run when they start, getting going to the nice sales demos from the sales people who are out there just trying to help us.
By the way, I have run into numerous CISO type people whose perspective is that they can save a bunch of money on training their employees because there are plenty of vendors willing to provide that training for free.
I cannot tell you how incredibly dangerous and terrible that is.
I'm with you.
I was there, man. I was on the inside. I used to do that. Believe me.
Yeah. So I guess the kind of just to maybe bring it to a close, the thing that concerns me, or the thing that I'm thinking about, is you a couple of minutes ago said something that I think really hit the nail on the head, that it takes seasoned leadership who's been there and done that to make some of these decisions. And I guess my point is, how do we characterize that? Is because no two people have the same set of experiences, and so there's got to be some there's got to be something there that we can describe so that people can maybe make better decisions that are more in line with those people who have lots of experience, because those people are basing their decisions on certain principles that they've just kind of collected in their minds. And my point is, how do we render those explicit so that other people can get the benefit of them? That's where I'm.
Well, you're kind of arguing for this thing that we've kicked around for the last 20 years, which is, should security engineering be a true engineering discipline that is taught as an engineering discipline, and everything that goes along with being a true engineer, which we throw around in the InfoSec and IT community, but it's not the same as a mechanical engineer or electrical engineer or whatever.
Yeah, maybe so, and maybe I'm thinking maybe even less like that and more like skilled trades. The journeyman, apprentice,
sure.
master cyberman.
But it comes down to these are the accepted ways of doing things in our industry.
Yes.
There's only a couple ways to run plumbing, right?
Correct.
And this is the code. This is what it says. The downside of that is limited innovation.
Yeah.
Right? So, I don't know. There's a plus and minus there, and maybe we'll.
Yeah, so I do think there's a risk of limited innovation, but I still think that if those things are, there's some timeless principles that I think we are, as we move forward, we're losing. Things like, what does least privilege mean?
Right.
And and other things which are they're not dependent on any particular technology. They were appropriate when we were talking about mainframes back in the 60s and 70s, and about PC networks in the 90s and 2000s, and in the cloud today. And it occurs to me that we're not, we're not really training people to deeply understand some core principles that would help make better decisions. That's, I guess, where I'm at.
Yeah, so, I hear you.
So anyway, I think I killed this several times over. So anyhow,
flogging the deceased equine, are you?
Yes. So that's really all the stories that we have for this evening. I do want to say thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you to our Patreon donors. You're very helpful. This service is not free to us, so we do invest a lot of time and personal time and money into the operation of this. So that helps. Thank you very much.
Yeah, honestly, you guys are awesome, and I'm always humbled when I see how many of you have chosen to donate. And thank you. And if you'd like to donate, if you'd like to be a new Patreon donor, we're always accepting new ones.
That's right.
Otherwise,
Absolutely.
We're going to have to get evil ads and talk to you about pillows and underwear.
We'll be reviewing random Amazon toiletries or whatever. It's going to be great.
I'm trying to think of all the other popular podcast ads right now that are out there.
Well, Audible is like the perennial thing that everybody talks about.
All right. Look at here. We're giving them free ads.
Okay. The audiobook service from that big online book retailer that sells everything but books these days. How about that?
Oh, you mean Barnes & Noble?
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, thanks for listening. Have a great week. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Take care.